our brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, students and scholars, teachers and trainers, professors and professionals, those who are listening, watching English literature, language, and grammar. Basically, our scholars, those who are preparing themselves for in NET examination, let us go through the Canterbury Tales. Chaucer probably read his tales aloud to his audience. At the time Chaucer wrote, there were 5 different accents spoken in English. These accents varied so much that a person of one section could not understand the whole of the other. The language of Chaucer is Middle English from 1100 to 1500 AD. Old English or Anglo-Saxon 597 AD to 1100 AD. Beowulf, the most famous literary work of the period, is an epic poem in alliterative verse, and also Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Middle English 1100 AD to 1500 AD. Geoffrey Chaucer 1340 to 1400 AD is the acknowledged literary master of this period. Modern period 1500 AD to present day, famous writers Shakespeare, Milton, etc. There is some argument among scholars about the dates for the linguistic periods, particularly regarding the shift from Old English to Middle English. Naturally, there was no overnight change from Old to Middle English, but the action which triggered the greatest change was the Norman conquest of England in 1066 AD. Thereafter, the English language exhibited a French influence, typical of the scholarly controversy which centers upon the assignment of an initial date to Middle English is an excellent 20th century article by Campbell entitled When Did Middle English Begin? The knight is the perfect gentleman who loved truth, chivalry, freedom, and honor. He was truly a distinguished man, one of the only 3 positively drawn characters. He had ridden into battle in both Christian and heathen lands, and in every instance served his king well. Despite his deeds, the knight never boasted of his actions, nor bored his listeners with his feats. The knight is the most socially prominent person on the journey. He tells the first tale and everybody praised him. The squire, the son of the knight, would be a candidate for knighthood. When not in battle, he thinks of himself as quite a lady's man. He takes meticulous care of his curly looks and is somewhat proud of his appearance. He is adept in dancing and singing and wearing a colorful dress. He could compose poetry and could ride a horse with distinction. He is just opposite to his father, the night. The prioress, the prioress named Madame Ingletine, who happens to be a nun, but never forgets that she is a lady first, was rather well educated, even though her French was not the accepted Persian French. When she ate, she looks great care that no morsel fell from her lips and that no stains were on her clothes. She tried to initiate the manners of the court. She could not stand pain and would weep to see a mouse caught in a trap. Her dress was very neat and tidy, and she wore a gold brooch with the inscription Amor Vincit Omnia. Her emphasis on her appearance and her possessions suggest that she secretly longs for a more worldly life. The monk, the monk was an outrider in charge of the outlying property for his monastery. He owned several horses, furnished with the finest saddles and brides. He loved hunting and fine foods. He had several hunting dogs of which he was very proud. He was rather fat, jolly, and bald headed. He favored an outdoor life to that of a closed indoor existence. His love of the worldly goods, food and pleasures, and his dislike of the quiet monastery contradict his religious vows. The friar. The friar was a person licensed to hear confessions and to beg for money. This friar used very vicious and immortal method to extract money from the parishioners. The friar was essentially notoriously evil and cunning. The friar named Herbert was a wanton and merry man who had helped many girls get married after he got them in trouble. When he heard confessions, he was under the principle that the penance is best executed by money rather than by prayers. So the person contributing the most money received the quickest and best pardon. The clerk, who was a student at Oxford, was probably working on his MA degree with the idea of attaining some type of ecclesiastical position. He rode a very thin horse, and his clothes were threadbare because he preferred to buy books rather than clothes. He did not talk often, but when he did, it was with great dignity and moral value. It is, next to the knight, one of the most admired people on the pilgrimage. The wife of Bath was somewhat deaf, but was an excellent seamstress and weaver. She made a point of being first at the altar or offering in the church. Her kerchiefs must have weighted 10 pounds, and she wore scarlet red stockings. She has been married 5 times and has been on many pilgrimages. She was gap toothed and rode a horse easily. She enjoyed good fellowship and would readily laugh and joke. Her special talent was her knowledge of all the remedies of love. The Persian. The Persian was an idea was an ideal Christian. Amid the worldly clerics and the false and superficial religious adherents, the poor Persian stands out as the ideal portrait of what a parish priest should be. Write a brief note on Chaucer humor as depicted in the Canterbury Tales. Humor is the soul and essence of Chaucer as an artist. Humor is found not only in humorous tales but in serious tales also. As in Shakespeare, Chaucer's humor is not confined to comedy alone. A.C. Ricketts remarks there are tragedies as well as comedies in the tales. Some are grave and subdued, others ablaze with color and merriment. But the thread of honest and kindly laughter runs through them, all serious and gay like. The humor of Chaucer is without a tinge of ill will and malice, spite and animosity. It is sympathetic and genial, while gently unshaking, while gently unmasking the roguery of rugs. He was grateful to them for the pleasure they afforded. Dear friends, your presence is really praiseworthy, admirable. Your presence today will make you able to understand the literature more conveniently. These are the fundamentals and basics of the literature for clearing any exam of literature. This is the starting that we study in Elizabethan age. William Shakespeare, who born in 1564. As we read that, there are so many resemblances among the starters of the different missions, like Shri Guru Nanak Dev Ji Maharaj, who born in 1469. Our India was discovered by Vasco da Gama in 1498. East India Company came in India in 1600. In between such important events, there was the birth of William Shakespeare in 1564. This period of 14th, 15th and 16th period in English literature we read as Elizabethan age. This Elizabethan age was really the remarkable age because of the freedom in invention. Everyone was free to write, read, speak, listen as per their will, whim or wish. This period was really the period of starters. Actually, this period we study in the history of Indian people as a history of the modernity. This was really the modern period in English literature, language and grammar. Dear friends, as you have read Imagism, that is from 1912 to 17, risen from T.E. Halme, propounded by Ezra Pound and Lowell, influenced by Japanese lyric from haiku, a reaction against symbolism. Imagist poetry aimed at concentration, abandoning conventional poetic style, material and versification, exact and simple language, concrete images, freedom of poetic form and poetic subject, new musical rhythms, choice of free verse and use of metaphors and juxtapositions. Causes of failure. Poet's inability to relate imagery to a central idea, the want of exact and concrete images. What are the main features of images or imagism? Rejected most of the 19th century poetry aimed at new clarity and exactness in the short lyric poem. Influenced by Japanese haiku, representation of ideas through precise concrete images, a reaction against symbolism. language for the common speech, but the exact word, expression of new moods and creation of new rhythms. Poet should be free to choose its subject. Poetry should be hard and clear, not blurred and indefinite. Concentration. These are the main features that helps in understanding imagism. What is imagism? To aim at concentration, to create new rhythm for the expression of new moods, to produce poetry that is hard and clear. To sum up imagism, a poetic movement in England and USA from 1909 to 1917 found its leading spokesman in Ezra Pound, who with F.S. Flint wrote an Imagist manifesto published in Poetry magazine in 1913. They emphasized ad rhythm composed in sequence of the musical phrase, not in sequence of metronome. Das Imagisty, the first Imagist anthology, was edited by Pound and published in 1914. Afterwards, Amy Lowell assumed leadership of the movement, helping to publish three further anthologies, all entitled Some Imagist Poets, 1915, 16 and 17. Symbolism. It is an introduction to the French literature, which Eliot found a revelation. It characterizes symbolism as a reaction against naturalism and realism as an attempt to spiritualize literature. It was to be a reflection, not merely a sign of spiritual reality, a kind of religion with all the duties and responsibilities of the sacred rituals. Symbolism emphasized the primary importance of suggestion and evocation. In the expression of private mood or reverie, the symbol was held to evoke subtle relations and affinities, especially between sound, sense, color, and between the material and spiritual worlds. The idea of similarities led to an interest in esoteric and occult writings and to ideas about the musicality of poetry, which combined with the Wagner cult stress and possibility of orchestrating the theme of a poem through the evocative power of words. Points to remember related to symbolism: reaction against nationalism and realism, spiritualization of literature based upon religion and sacred rituals, expression of private mood and reverie, lays stress on the musicality of a poem, use of symbols for the fusion of material and spiritual, sound, sense, and color, interest in esoteric and occult writings. In the essay entitled Magic Yeats, recorded his beliefs in three doctrines which have been, he declared, the foundations of nearly all magical practices. The doctrines were that the borders of our minds are ever shifting. Dear friends, we find a great resemblance and similarities between the thoughts of our social reformist Swami Vivekananda, who wrote in his writings about the materialism. This materialistic life cannot provide us the true meaning of literature. The real literary definitions and explanations give us, provide us the chance to meet the spiritual power. All the literary terminologies, literary definitions that we read. They have the magic and music behind them of spirituality. This was strongly propounded by Swami Vivekananda. When he went to the USA, he told to the worldly people, my brothers and sisters of the America, even beyond to it, success means not any platform, but success is the name of continuity and regularity, unrelentingly, unceasingly, and unstoppingly. This materialistic world attracts us as we read in the American literature from Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, who was the first Prime Minister of our India. He kept on his table such lines: the woods are lovely, dark, deep. The woods are lovely, dark, and deep, but I have promises miles to go before I sleep. Means the word is the attractive, allurementative, temptative, but the ultimate truth of life is spiritualism. How our soul can reunite with the super spiritual power of God. This is the topic that is addressed by our Indian scholars, Indian researchers to the worldly people, for the different university scholars. Dear friends, beyond to it, when he was given the chance to speak in the religious conference of the USA, he told the meaning of one word. Similarly, our President President Modi ji, who is a staunch and ardent believer of such social reformist, at one place he writes that unread, unspoken, unheard is more powerful, effective than read, spoken, and written. This is a philosophy that is based upon the spiritual science of our Indian psychology and philosophy that should be used, that should be adopted in our English literature, language, and grammar. Basically, we are the staunch believer and follower of re, in, and dish. These words tell us and make us able to remember our past, our history, our recordings, downloadings. Really helpful to know the present, but we are to be creative and imaginative in the different fields. Dear friends, as in the literature of Romanticism, you have heard about this priest of nature, William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth explains the objectives with which the poems, the lyrical ballads, 1798 were written, that the poems contain incidents and situations from common life, a selection of language really used by men, a novel shape by throwing over them a certain coloring of imagination, ordinary things presented to the mind in an unusual way, traced the primary laws of our nature, and that he had avoided the so-called poetic diction in these poems. According to William Wordsworth, he says, poetry means pleasure. Poetry is the spontaneous overflow of our powerful feelings, recollected in tranquility of our heart and mind. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. The emotion is contemplated till by a species of reaction. The tranquility gradually disappears, and an emotion kindled to that which before was the subject of contemplation is gradually produced and does itself actually exist in mind. In this mood, successful composition generally begins and is carried on. The first stage in the poetic process is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. The next, their recollection in tranquility, and the last, their expression in poetry. Wordsworth himself composed his poems on the same principles. In the poems like Daffodils, Solitary Reaper, and to some extent Tintern Abbey, the object was observed and stored in memory, and during the time of creation recalled to the memory. Difference between 1800 and 1805 edition of preface. In the revised preface of 1815, Wordsworth assigned a higher function to both fancy and imagination. He held both to be creative and not simply reproducing faculties, with this difference only that while imagination fused all things into one, making them take one color and serve to one effect, fancy shaped them more or less willfully. The creation of the one means imagination were sublime of the other, fancy only beautiful. Is Dryden a liberal classicist as a critic? In spite of the respect paid to the classic rules by Sidney and Johnson and other ancients of France, Dryden would not surrender his own right of judgment. Rules cannot be binding in their totality on all nations and ages, since language, temper, taste vary from age to age and country to country, and the ages and nations cannot be continued to be like that of Aristotle forever. The rules must be adjusted accordingly. For though the nature is same in all places and reason to the same, yet the climate, the age, the disposition of the people to which a poet writer may be so different that what pleased the Greeks would not satisfy an English audience. He advocates a close study of ancient models, not to imitate them blindly as a thoroughgoing neoclassicist would do, but to recapture their message, to treat them as torch, to enlighten our passage. It is the spirit of the classics that matters more than their rules. Yet these rules are not without their value. For without rules there can be no art, any more than can be a house without a door to conduct you into it. There is but one part of the artist's work for which not rule over was or ever can be given, and that is invention. Invention means the disposition of the work, to put all things in a beautiful order and harmony, that the whole may be of a piece. It is not the observance of rules that makes a work great, but its capacity to delight and transport, and to do not once or twice but always. He mentioned rules for the design or arrangement and expression as led by Aristotle. The business of criticism is not to detect petty faults but to discover those great beauties that make it immortal. A great writer whose sometimes error is preferred to a middling or indifferent one who is free from error. Longinus, a faulty genius, is better than a correct mediocrity. He is a liberal classicist, as he would adjust rules of the ancients to the genius of the age to which a poet writes. Antiquity alone is no plea for the excellence of a poem. How does Dr. Johnson defend tragicomedy? Life is itself a mingled yarn of good, evil, joy, and sorrow. The alteration of pleasure and pain in a play pleases us by its variety, and it does not result in any weakening of effect. Tragicomedy is nearer to life than either pure tragedy or pure comedy. So it combines within itself the pleasures and instruction of both. As practiced by Shakespeare, it is even a distinct species of the dramatic art exhibiting the real state of sublunary nature which partakes of good and evil, joy and sorrow, mingled with endless variety of proportion and innumerable modes of combination, and expressing the course of the world in which the loss of one is the gain of another. According to preface to Shakespeare, dear friends, as you have read William Shakespeare, who is known as the king of literature, he emphasized upon tragedy. Tragedy is better than comedy according to Shakespeare because tragedy creates pity and fear. It brings purgation, purification, and cathartic effect. So Shakespeare throughout his lifetime, important tragedies are The Merchant of Venice, King Lear, Othello, Hamlet, that are full of psychological elements. Thus, it will be seen that there is practically no difference between Johnson's approach to the tragicomedy and Dryden's, but while the later Dryden remained undecided to the end, the former Johnson, with nature ever as high guide, has no doubts whatever on the subject. Epic theatre, the theory and to some extent the practice of the modern German dramatist Bertolt Brecht, wishing to avoid the characteristics of what he called the Aristotelian drama, a creation of the illusion of reality, a sense that the action is occurring in the present, and identification with the central figures of the play, and a cathartic emotional release. Brecht tried to create a non-Aristotelian drama in which the audience would sense the action as already in the past and would view it with the calm detachment supposedly evoked by the original singers of epoch or epic. The aim of the epic theatre was to lead the audience not to feel intentionally but to judge critically, to see the character's action as determined not by fate and human nature but by the social circumstances, to leave the theatre not emotionally drained but intellectually stimulated and determined to bring about Marxist reforms. To achieve this effect of emotional distance called the alienation effect, Brecht made use of short, self-contained scenes. Instead, translated from French to mean end of the century, the phrase connects the lassitude, satiety, and ennui expressed by many writers of the decadence. The late years of the 19th century are sometimes called decadent because of the decline from Victorian standards. Oscar Wilde, Arthur Symons, and Aubrey Beardsley, notable English artists, Ernest Dowson and Lionel Johnson. The 1890s was a transitional period during which writers and artists were abandoning old ideas and conventions and attempting to discover new techniques and artificial objectives. The phrase may also be applied to any other end of age or end of century periods. The picture of Dorian Gray 1891, Wilde's novel Salome 1893, Wilde's play, poems of Ernest Dowson are representatives of the period. The Impressionistic and Romantic School, John Middleton Murray, M. Jules Leometre. They are concerned with recording their personal impressions when they are in contact with a given mark of art without attempting to generalize or draw inferences. An impressionistic critic, M. Jules Lemaitre says, criticism, whatever be its pretensions, can never go beyond defining the impression which at a given moment is made on us by a work of art, wherein the artist himself recorded the impression he received from the world at a certain hour. The impressionistic critics are impatient of all dogmas and processes of the labeling and codification. Thus, they are, in a sense, romantic in their attitude. The Impressionism is the application to literature of the doctrine of the French Impressionistic school of painters. It was used of much of the descriptive writings of the 1980s. Impressionists undertook to represent objectives as they appear to the artist in a particular vantage point instead of duplicating exactly their physical properties. In English poetry, Impressionism influenced the Imagist poets. If an area of darkness pictures the India, the geophysical India which Noipal actually visited and saw, is a house for Mr. Vishwas, gives us yet another picture of India. What we find in this novel is not the actual country called India, visited and seen by Naipaul, but an Indian society which reflects a life and culture which is still Indian, though located thousands of miles away from the actual land. In other words, this novel presents a miniature Indian society. It is no doubt a transplanted society, a society uprooted from its native soil 2 generations ago and replanted on a foreign soil. It has now been exposed to the impact of other races, other cultures, other languages, and other ways of life. It has assumed many new dimensions, still it remains an Indian society. The core of that society, which is still Indian, for it has retained its basic culture, its styles, its beliefs and practices. The Indian society in this novel is the setting for the story. It is indeed a work of fiction and the characters are fictitious, but they are in another sense real. It is a real Indian society which is of course very different from the Indian societies in India. The principal scene of action for this novel is Hanuman House, the house of the Tulsis. A careful study of the way in which this house is pictured convinces us that it is really an Indian home, almost a miniature India. It is pupilled by Indian characters, and the very structure of the house and the organization of the household is Indian. In fact, even the landscape that is pictured featured in the novel has much in common with the Indian landscape. We can see the rural and village atmosphere in Noipal's description of landscape. When he speaks about Mr. Viswas' childhood days, he says Mr. Viswas moves to the cane fields to weed and clean and plant and reap. These cane fields, weeding, cleaning, and planting make us think of Indian cane fields and the agricultural operations in the fields. In a house for Mr. Vishwas, Noipal gives much importance to Hanuman house. He has a vague idea of Indian houses, and to that he adds an imaginative coloring and builds up Hanuman house in his own words. He pictures the house as follows: among the tumble down timber and corrugated iron buildings in the high street of Arvakes, Hanuman house stood like an alien white fortress. The concrete walls looked as thick as they were, and when the narrow doors of Tulsi's store became bulky, impregnable, and bleak, the side walls were windowless, and on the upper two floors, the windows were mere slits in the facade. The balustrade, which has the flat roof, was crowned with a concrete statue of the benevolent monkey god Hanuman. Thus, there is a great deal of Indian atmosphere, and it is worth noting how the description of the details of the Tulsi home suggests that it is a typical Indian home. Naipal also mentions about the Tulsi's storeroom, which is always dark. He sees the spaces he sees the spacious hall smelling of smoke and old wood. The pale green paint has grown dim and dingy, and the timbers reveal the wood lice, which leaves wood looking so new where it is rotten. Naipal points out that the kitchen has mud walls and it is lower than the hall and appears to be completely without light. The doorway is gapped black. Its ceiling is just above, so that blackness seemed to fill the kitchen like a solid substance. The most important piece of nature in the Tulsi's hall is a long unvarnished pitch pine table, and there is hammock made from sugar sacks hanging free one corner of the room. There is an old sewing machine, a baby chair, and a black biscuit drum occupy the other end of the hall. The furniture like chairs, stools, and benches are scattered all over the room. The more elegant pieces are a desk, a dresser, a piano, but even these things are buried among papers and baskets, and vacant space is dark and dusty. It is examined with sorts of articles which Mr. Vishwas cannot distinguish. Naipal does not fail to describe the rural huts, the village huts, which are again reminiscent of the Indian rural landscape. The hut's walls are mud walls, and it is freshly whitewashed and decorated with blue and green and red palm prints. It is so crowded. The pictures which Noipal draws here are mostly the pictures of India, for they are just like the huts and cottages which one sees in the rural parts of India. Again, life in the Hanuman house is characteristically Indian, both in its daily routine and in its seasonal activities. The Tulsi's life is typically Indian. Noipal criticizes the Indian way of life, and he is deeply upset by their way of living. The whole household duties are controlled by Mrs. Tulsi, and Seth Noipal observes the fact that in Tulsi's house they are using brass plate and blue rimmed enamel cup. The two sisters of the Shama take the cup containing milky tea and the plate with radish and curried beans The house is full of noise. No hears the shouting of children, equaling and being slapped. In the gallery outside the children, he sees peeping at him from the kitchen doorway. Mr. Vishwas is invited for the lunch in the Hanuman house. He sees the mound of rice on a brass plate, lights budge on fresh food, and three are stains all around the pitch pine table. Dislikes he dislikes the food and dislikes eating of brass plates. Dear friends, all of you, those who are present today, really praiseworthy, admirable, and appreciable moment. We are admiring our words, thoughts, ideas of English literature, language, and grammar with you. The blessings of Lord today from Chaudhry Devlal University, Sirsa district, Haryana to abroad, all our scholars and learners, those who are listening, watching, 3M Creator, Dr. who is the guide of literature in CDLU University for the research scholars. Really, his words are informable, knowledgeable, informative, instructive, and directive. Thank you for your presence. Thank you, dear friends. Thank you.